Hey everyone, welcome to Thinking Christian, and in this video what I want to do is talk about St. Anselm's ontological argument for the existence of God. I think this is one of the most widely misunderstood arguments in philosophy, so what I'm going to do is explain one formulation of the argument, explain why it's going to appear really dumb on the surface, then we're going to try to understand the context because Anselm is coming from Platonic Metaphysics and we need to understand his argument in the context of Platonic Metaphysics, and then hopefully you'll understand the argument a little bit more or get a little bit more appreciation for it. So the first formulation that he talks about goes like this. Premise 1, God is the greatest possible being. He is the being with which nothing greater can be imagined. So he's taking this as the definition of God. Premise 2, God exists as an idea in the mind. We can think of the possibility of a greatest possible being. Premise 3, a being that exists as an idea in the mind and in reality is, on all other things being equal, greater than a being that exists only as an idea in the mind. Premise 4, thus, if God exists only as an idea in the mind, we can imagine something that is greater than God, basically a God that exists in reality as well as in the mind. We're not supposed to be able to imagine something that is greater than God because it would be a contradiction to suppose that we could imagine a being greater than the greatest possible being that could be imagined. Therefore, God exists. Now, on the surface, what it looks like we're doing is basically saying it's better for things to exist than to not exist. Therefore, God must exist because he's the greatest possible being. And as a result, Arthur Schopenhauer called this argument a charming joke. And I used to agree. I would have probably thought Dawkins's version of this argument, a maximally stinky poop that, it would be stinkier if it actually existed than if it didn't. So therefore, a maximally stinky poop must exist. I used to think about all these things, but I think this misunderstands the argument and how it rests on Platonic metaphysics. As Alvin Plantinga says, at first sight, Anselm's argument is remarkably unconvincing, if not downright irritating. It looks too much like a parlor puzzle or word magic. But let's try to understand this in context, and I think this second formulation will hopefully clear things up. This really comes down to what we mean by greatness or greatest being, and we're going to talk about this a little bit more, but let's go ahead and look at the second formulation of this argument. How does it appears in St. Anselm's work? It goes like this. Premise 1, God is the greatest possible being. Premise 2, a being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Premise 3, thus by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, we can imagine something that is greater than God, namely something that exists necessarily. But we cannot imagine something that is greater than God because God is the greatest possible being. Thus, if God exists as an idea in the mind, God exists necessarily in reality, and because God exists as an idea in the mind, therefore God exists necessarily in reality. Now let's unpack what's going on here. I think there's a lot of stuff going on. I want you to understand what we mean by this. The key here is the word greatest. Anselm isn't necessarily using greatest to refer to perfect or in our typically use of the word greatest. He's using greatest in a Platonic sense. For instance, and to basically support this point, consider this, right? Actual evil is not better than an imagined evil just because it exists. So just something existing metaphysically does not necessarily make it better than something not existing. Nor is it clear that my future house will be better if it exists than if it does not exist. And this is Malcolm's, formulation of this, and he's one of the contemporary people who's commented on this argument. So what's actually going on here? Well, as this paper will say, there is sufficient textual evidence that Anselm did not mean better or more perfect when he uses the word greater. And to basically support this claim, he uses the word maius 5 times and melius once. And this is the difference between greater in one context versus better or more perfect. So the fact that he's actually differentiating between these two words gives us a clue as to what's actually going on here. When we say God is the greatest possible being, what we mean is God is being to its maximal extent. It's not that God is the greatest of all possible beings. Rather, God is the embodiment of being itself. He is being to its maximum Platonic amount. In other words, God surpasses all things in being in a sort of Platonic way. Think about it like this. We can think about a circle, but we can generally always think about a better circle. If I write a circle down, we can imagine a circle that is, more circly than this. In other words, in a Platonic sense, a perfect circle would be better than a circle that has some imperfections to it or that shows up on a computer. Being, in the sense that we're talking about, the existence of being necessarily, being not contingent on other beings, is what we mean by the greatest possible being. A being that exists on its own versus a being that exists on other things. In other words, what's going on here, if God only exists as an idea in the mind, then our mind is the thing that is creating God. God is then contingent on our minds. So that means God is not the greatest possible being. Rather, the thing that is going to be the greatest possible being is the necessary being that gives rise to all existence. That would be the thing. Now, if God does not exist, then what is the thing that gives rise to all other things? What is the necessary thing? The point of this argument is to go from possibility, if it is possible that something contingent exists, then it is necessary that it exists because by contingency, that is the source of all things in their being, why things exist at all, why anything exists at all. So let's look at a few objections and talk more about this contingency here. So when we talk about the perfect island objection, which this was a monk replying to Anselm, was like, well, couldn't we say there could be a perfect island out there, and a perfect island would be better if it existed in reality than not? First thing to note is it's not clear that a perfect island could exist. If we added more palm trees, could we imagine a better island? I mean, how many palm trees are in the best possible island? But notice Anselm's reply to this. Notice Anselm's reply to the perfect island objection. He doesn't go about talking about whether or not a perfect island actually exists. Instead, he says a perfect island does not exist necessarily, which means he is invoking being and necessity together. Here is what somebody else says. It is greater to exist necessarily compared to existing contingently, recognized by Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm, who interpret Anselm as saying God must be either necessary or impossible. Another way to put this is God cannot even be thought not to exist, because basically for some intelligence to think of something better than God, this creature would be above and judge its creator, and that would be completely absurd. For instance, if God does not exist and I am the one creating the idea of God in my own mind, then I would be God, because I am the thing that is basically the necessary thing that is in creating the greatest possible being and invoking it. So God is the greatest in being in the sense that he is being to its maximal and least contingent amount. A being that existed in our minds would be contingent on our minds, would not exist necessarily. So once again, the point here is that God is being to its maximum amount, because being to its maximum amount would not be contingent on anything else. It would exist necessarily. That's the main point. So hopefully you get a better understanding for Anselm's argument. What do you guys think? Do you have a better appreciation for the argument? Do you still find it convincing? Once again, I think this argument makes more sense when you think about it in the context of contingency rather than just using greatness to define something into existence, which once again I think misunderstands the Platonic metaphysics behind Anselm's idea. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.